Welcome to our latest Wandering Walks of Wonder tour. Today, we're headed to Huntsville, Alabama. This area was long known to travelers for its big spring, which was a reliable source of fresh water. We'll actually see that spring here in just a bit. There were some half-hearted attempts at settlement, but an abundance of mosquitoes and black bears sent homesteaders elsewhere. But John Hunt, a Revolutionary War veteran, persevered in 1805. Hunt did not have the money to register his claim properly, and Hunt Spring, as he called the area, and much of the surrounding land were gobbled up by a Georgian planter and lawyer named Leroy Pope for $23 an acre. The energetic Pope laid out streets, built a house on the village's highest hill, and got his town named the county seat for Madison County that had formed in 1808 and named for the newly sworn-in fourth president of the United States, James Madison. Pope named the town Twickenham after the estate of his distant relative, the celebrated English satiric poet Alexander Pope. The name never caught on with the newcomers who arrived to live in the town, and the territorial legislature then named the town after squatter John Hunt. As we go through the tour today, we'll see many historic buildings as well as other architectural features in town. One of those that we've walked past right now as we begin our walk is the Huntsville Museum of Art. That museum itself was established in 1970 and held its first exposition in 1973. The collection is divided into American and regional art and moved into the Von Braun Civic Center when it opened in 1975, but relocated to its own facility here in 1998. Huntsville grew rapidly on the back of King Cotton as the surrounding fields could yield 1,000 pounds of the crop per acre. The town was peppered with the offices of those involved in the cotton trade, including factors, lawyers, and bankers. During harvest season, Huntsville would be overrun with carts and wagons of cotton farmers bringing their crops to be graded and auctioned off. The entire west side of Court Square at the center of town was reserved for businesses and often called Cotton Row. As a frontier metropolis, Huntsville hosted the Alabama Constitutional Convention to hammer out the details pursuant to statehood in 1819. When Alabama was accepted into the Union as the 22nd state, Huntsville was designated the temporary capital. Here, Alabama's first governor was inaugurated and its first legislature convened. We're now headed towards Big Spring Park. This is the largest limestone spring in Alabama with a daily flow of between 7 and 20 million gallons of water. Landmarks scattered around the park are gifts to the city from around the world, many from foreign nationals who studied at the Ordnance Guided Missile Center in Huntsville. Among them are a 1903 light beacon and a 1929 fog bell from Norway, a bench from Great Britain, and a sundial from Germany. On our right, what you see that looks like a river is actually a canal known as Fern Canal. In 1821, the Indian Creek Navigation Company, with Thomas Fern at the helm, began digging a canal here, and 3 years later, Huntsville was linked to the Tennessee River. The canal was phased out after the arrival of the railroads, and its remains stay here as well as the foundations in the park. Hi. In 1855, the Memphis and Charleston Railroad was constructed through Huntsville, becoming the first railway to link the Atlantic seacoast with the lower Mississippi River. The Civil War, during which Huntsville was used as a Union base of operations after the town fell in 1863, put a crimp on progress, but after the war the area became a center for cotton textile mills, and a building boom took place that lasted from the 1890s until the Great Depression of the 1930s. During that time, other industries and crops became prominent, most notably watercress. So much of the semi-aquatic vegetable was cultivated in the 1940s that the area was known as the watercress capital of the world. Still, by 1940, Huntsville was a small town of some about 13,000 people. But with the coming of World War II, the government built 3 chemical munitions plants just southwest of the city, employing over 20,000 personnel. When the war ended, the plants were mothballed and designated for redevelopment. One attempt was by the Keller Motor Company, but only 18 of their innovative automobiles were ever produced before the death of George D. Keller brought an end to production. In 1950, the United States Army brought its Ordnance Guided Missile Center to the abandoned plants under the leadership of Wernher von Braun, acknowledged as the greatest rocket scientist of the 20th century. The work in Huntsville and the foundation for America's space program earned the city the nickname Rocket City. We're now walking into Court Square, where we see the Madison County Courthouse. The town was laid out in a grid pattern beginning in 1810 with the construction of a small brick courthouse on this site. It looked out on an assortment of frame and brick stores around the square, which took about 50 years to fill up. This particular courthouse that we see, built in the international style, was completed in 1967 and is the fourth to occupy this site. The Bank of the State of Alabama was established by the legislature in 1823 at the then capital of Cowaba. Branches were set up in Montgomery, Mobile, and Decatur in 1832. The Huntsville branch was created in 1835 and established in this grand Greek Revival temple fronted by the Ionic columns that we see. Scandals in a national economic panic in 1837 sunk the state bank, and in 1856 the first national bank was established here. The bank would be one of 3 pillars of today's Birmingham-based Regions Bank in 1971, and banking operations would be conducted inside here until 2010, making it one of the longest continually operating bank buildings in the United States. It served as a hospital for Union soldiers during the Civil War and once held a rifle owned by Frank James and the notorious James Gang as collateral for bail money when he was incarcerated across the street in the old Madison County Jail. In the middle of the block, in a small brick building, was once the Planters and Merchants Bank of Huntsville that took its first deposits on October 17, 1817, becoming the first bank in Alabama. Here on our right is the Harrison Brothers hardware store. James and Daniel Harrison went into business in Huntsville in 1879 when the brothers began selling tobacco in a small shop on Jefferson Street. The Harrisons moved to this location in 1897, and over the years, their stock evolved from tobacco and now included crockery, furniture, jewelry, appliances, and finally into hardware. Draped in success, they expanded into the adjoining building in 1902. The Harrison family operated the store until 1983, but the business did not die with the last Harrison. The buildings were purchased by the nonprofit Historic Huntsville Foundation and renovated not as a museum, but as an operating store staffed by volunteers. Today, Harrison Brothers is the oldest operating hardware store in the state of Alabama. Ahead of us is the Schiffman building. This uniform block of federal-style brick buildings was disturbed in 1895 when architect George W. Thompson of Nashville transformed the end of one of the structures into an interpretation of Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. Based on the stylings of Henry Richardson, the most influential American architect of the late 19th century, the building displays such trademarks as rough-cut stone, wide arches, and corner towers. In 1905, the building was purchased by German-born Isaac Schiffman, a cotton broker and investor. 3 years earlier, in an apartment in the building, Tallulah Bankhead was born into a political family that included her grandfather John, a U.S. Senator, and her father William, who would go on to become Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. At the age of 15, Tallulah convinced her parents to go to New York, where she began an acting career in cinema, radio, and television. This elegant brick structure played host on June 2, 1819 to President James Monroe and his entourage while on a 3-day tour of the Alabama Territory as it prepared to become a state. When Huntsville was tabbed as the first temporary capital, the first Alabama legislature convened on October 25, 1819. This building was once the historic Huntsville Inn. On our right is the Milligan block. This particular commercial block of buildings from 1900 shows an abundance of colonial revival detailing, including from the top down, a medallion block cornice, keystones over Romanesque-style windows, pediment doors, as well as street-level windows with fan lights. Ahead of us, that block-like building is actually a very historic building. This Art Moderne vault was designed in 1948 by Warren Knight and Davis of Birmingham and stands as the only example of this style of architecture in Huntsville. The exterior has survived virtually unaltered. From his base in Troy, Fox Henderson was president of a passel of banks, including the family-owned Henderson National Banks. In 1881, at the precocious age of 28, Henderson and his brother Jer purchased their first bank, Pike County, which they renamed Farmers and Merchants National Bank. Another brother, Charles, would become governor of Alabama in 1914. The tall 12-story building that we see in front of us is known as the Hotel Russell Erskine. Albert Russell Erskine was born in Huntsville in 1871 and carved out a successful business career with the American Cotton Company and the Underwood Typewriter Company, among others, before he joined the Studebaker Motor Company in South Bend, Indiana in 1911. By 1915, he was president, guiding the automobile maker into one of the leading players in the auto industry. When plans for Huntsville's first major hotel were hatched in the 1920s, Erskine invested $10,000 in his hometown project, and the finished 12-story Neo-Georgian skyscraper was named in his honor. With Studebaker riding high, the Great Depression that began in October of 1929 took car sales crashing with the economy. Erskine was slow to pull back on production, however, and Studebaker found itself short of cash and went into bankruptcy in March of 1933. 3 months later, saddled with both his company's and his own mounting debts, Russell Erskine put a bullet in his heart. The hotel now serves as an apartment complex for the elderly. The building that we see here is the Terry Hutchins Building. This 7-story building, constructed for the Tennessee Valley Bank in 1926, was the first structure in Huntsville to utilize a steel frame with non-load-bearing walls. J.N. McKee designed the 85-foot-high Gothic Revival Tower, and it's listed today on the National Register of Historic Places. funds for this federal building ahead of us, that is both the post office and courthouse, were provided in 1932 by the Works Progress Administration, or commonly called the WPA. It was the only Great Depression relief funds that flowed into Huntsville for construction of buildings. The stripped-down classicism of the design reflects the popularity of Art Deco style for government buildings during that era. The three-story building of buff brick is augmented by a central limestone projection. Inside the courtroom is a mural by Xavier Gonzalez, part of another Depression-era initiative to hire American artists. The four-story Neo-Georgian Yarborough Hotel opened in 1924 to service business travelers to Huntsville. Anyone looking for a banquet hall or ballroom could look elsewhere. This building is marked by decorative brickwork and a bracketed cornice. The tall building that we see in front of us is the Times building. The Huntsville Times, the leading newspaper of northern Alabama for many decades, published its first editions from about this corner in a tottering shack on March 23, 1910. The story goes that when it rained, an employee was first forced to hold an umbrella under the leaky roof to keep the presses dry. The paper moved on to better digs, but was back in 1928 constructing this Renaissance Revival tower, many considered to be the finest building in downtown Huntsville. The Times departed this building for more modern facilities outside of town in 1955, where it continues to publish well into its second century of operations. The first Methodists in Huntsville were ministered to by circuit riding preachers until 1832, when this land was acquired for a church that was raised in 1834. The original sanctuary was burned by mistake by Union soldiers during the Civil War. The current Romanesque-style structure was dedicated in 1874. Ahead of us is the Church of the Nativity, an Episcopal church. This congregation organized in December of 1842, and with the Christmas season approaching, the name Church of the Nativity was selected. This ground was purchased in 1845, and the first church building, crafted of local brick, was holding services in August of 1847. The parish prospered quickly, and scarcely 10 years later, noted church architects Frank Wills and Henry Dudley of New York were retained to construct a new sanctuary. The new brick church, with a soaring 151-foot spire, was hailed as the finest Gothic Revival building in the South when it was dedicated on Easter Eve, 1859. The cost of $37,500 was covered solely by pew rentals to the church membership, which was about 53 people strong at the time. The original church stood next door until it was razed in 1878, and the Bib Chapel in the complex was consecrated in 1888. The building, the white building that we see on the left of us, is known as the Weeden House Museum. Henry C. Bradford, a prosperous merchant from Nashville, constructed this imposing Federal-style mansion as a showcase on the Alabama frontier in 1819. Bradford's economic fortunes turned for the worse, and he moved to Texas shortly thereafter, and William Weeden moved his family here in 1845. Weeden died unexpectedly, but the home stayed in the family until 1956. For the remainder of this video, we are walking through what is known as Constitution Village. This complex of early Huntsville frame buildings on their original sites remembers the town in the days from its founding in 1805 until July 5, 1819, when 44 delegates of the Constitutional Convention gathered actually in this white frame building that we see in front of us here in a vacant cabinet shop to organize Alabama as the 22nd state of the Union. Surrounding the cabinet shop are a print shop, a law office, a land surveyor's office, and Sheriff Stephen Neal's residence. During open hours of operation, you can tour inside many of these buildings. I hope you've enjoyed this Wandering Walks of Wonder tour here in beautiful as well as historic downtown Huntsville, Alabama. If you're a resident of Huntsville, leave a comment on what life is like in your city. Also, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and we will see you on our next Wandering Walks of Wonder walking tour. Take care now. Bye-bye.